Arthur paid $150 for silence, not for rotting wood. The seller handed over the keys with a haste that didn't match the property's worthless state, but on his first stormy night, the absolute isolation was broken by a muffled sound, coming from directly beneath the floorboards, where the broker swore there was only solid concrete. Arthur Miller counted the bills twice before sliding them across the warped table. $150. Everything he had left after selling the truck, the tools, and the life he'd spent 30 years building. The real estate agent, a woman with tired eyes and cheaper perfume, pushed the deed toward him without meeting his gaze. "You sure about this?" she asked, her pen hovering over the signature line. "Property's been sitting for a reason. No power, no heat, roof's half gone. You'd be better off with—" "I'm sure." She didn't argue. People like her had seen enough desperate men to know when words were wasted. The cabin was 40 miles outside Ravens Creek, Washington, buried so deep in the valley that even the loggers had forgotten it existed. Arthur wanted forgotten. Wanted the kind of silence that only comes when you're too far from everything to hear your own thoughts echoing back. The accident had been 8 months ago. A hydraulic line failure on the excavator. The boom had swung wide, catching young Tommy Reeves across the chest. The kid was 23, about to be married, working his first real job out of trade school. The investigation cleared Arthur. Equipment malfunction. Manufacturer's fault. Nothing he could have prevented. But Tommy's mother had looked at him at the funeral with eyes that said otherwise. And Arthur, who'd operated heavy machinery for 3 decades without incident, couldn't argue with her silent accusation. He'd started drinking, lost his CDL, lost his wife when she finally accepted that grief had made him into someone else, lost the house when the medical bills from his own spiral, 3 trips to the ER for alcohol poisoning, ate through their savings. And now he was buying a death trap in the wilderness with the last of his money, because dying slowly in the woods seemed more honest than pretending to live in town. The drive up the mountain took 4 hours in the borrowed pickup. The road deteriorated from asphalt to gravel to mud, until finally it wasn't a road at all, just tire ruts cutting through dense stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar. The trees were so thick that daylight barely penetrated, even at noon. When Arthur finally reached the clearing, he understood why nobody wanted this place. The cabin leaned, not dramatically, but enough that you noticed it immediately, the whole structure tilting slightly downslope toward the river. The cedar siding had gone black with rot in places, and several windows were missing entirely, covered with moldy plywood. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine, but it had 4 walls and a door that still closed, and that was more than Arthur needed. He parked and sat in the truck for a long moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The forest was loud here, not the peaceful quiet he'd imagined, but a constant roar of the river mixed with wind through the canopy and the intermittent crack of dead branches falling. The air smelled like wet earth and decay. Arthur grabbed his duffel bag and the case of cheap whiskey he'd bought in town. If he rationed it right, it would last 2 months. After that, well, he hadn't planned that far ahead. The door resisted when he pushed, swollen from moisture, but gave way with a groan. Inside was worse than outside. Water damage had buckled the floor in several places. Something, raccoons maybe, or rats, had built nests in the corners. The furniture that remained was skeletal, broken down to component pieces. But in the center of the main room stood an old wood stove, cast iron, ancient but intact. Arthur tested the chimney flue. It moved. That meant fire. Fire meant heat. Heat meant he might actually survive the winter, though he wasn't sure that was the goal. He spent the rest of the afternoon making the place minimally habitable, swept out the worst of the debris, nailed cardboard over the broken windows, found enough dry wood in a collapsed shed out back to get a fire started. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Arthur sat in front of the stove with a bottle and watched the flames. This was it. This was how it ended. Not with a bang, not with some dramatic gesture, just a slow fade in a forgotten place. He raised the bottle in a mock toast to Tommy Reeves, to his ex-wife, to everyone he'd failed. Then he drank until the world got soft around the edges and he could finally sleep. The sound woke him at 3 a.m. At first, Arthur thought it was an animal. The cry was high-pitched, distressed, definitely organic. But as he lay there in the darkness, his head pounding from the whiskey, he realized it wasn't quite right for a coyote or a bird. It was rhythmic, insistent, and it was coming from inside the cabin. He fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking from withdrawal and cold. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty space and his own breath misting in the frigid air. The sound continued, not constant but in bursts. Cry, pause, cry, pause. Arthur's mind, still half drunk, struggled to place it. Then recognition hit him like a physical blow. That was a baby crying. Arthur's first thought was that he was losing his mind. Grief and alcohol had finally broken something fundamental in his brain, and he was hallucinating. But the sound persisted, achingly real, coming from somewhere below him. He stomped on the floor. The crying stopped for a moment, then resumed, more urgent, under the floor. Arthur dropped to his knees, running his hands over the warped boards. Near the back wall, he found what he was looking for, a section where the planks didn't quite line up, where someone had cut through and replaced them. The cuts were clean, recent, made with a power saw. His heart hammering now, Arthur wedged his fingers into the gap and pulled. The boards came up easier than they should have, revealing a space about 4 feet square that had been carved into the foundation. And in that space, surrounded by pink insulation and connected to a small oxygen tank, was a thermal crate, the kind used for transporting organs. Except this one had air holes, and inside was a baby. Arthur stared, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The infant was maybe a week old, wrapped in a hospital blanket, its face red from crying. Next to the crate was a digital timer connected to what looked like a road flare, the kind used for emergencies, except this one had been modified with a trigger mechanism and positioned directly against a pile of oily rags. The timer read 00.4723, 47 minutes. Arthur's hands moved before his brain caught up. He grabbed the baby, who immediately intensified its crying, and carefully, so carefully, disconnected the trigger wire from the flare. His fingers were thick and clumsy from years of manual labor, but he'd worked with enough explosives in construction to know that jerking the wire could complete the circuit. When it finally came free, he let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The baby screamed in his arms, tiny fists waving. Arthur had never held an infant before, had never wanted to, never thought he'd have reason to, but some instinct made him tuck the child against his chest, and after a moment, the crying subsided into hiccuping sobs. That's when Arthur saw the hospital tag around the baby's ankle. Not a name, a code, RVN Sterling 2419 stillborn, except this baby was very much alive. Arthur's mind raced. Someone had hidden this child here. Someone had rigged an incendiary device set to go off in less than an hour. Someone had sold him this cabin, dirt cheap, no questions asked, knowing exactly what was hidden beneath it. He was supposed to be here when the fire started. He was supposed to die with the baby, and anyone investigating would find 2 bodies, a drunk hermit and an unknown infant. Tragic accident, case closed. But why? The tag provided the first clue. Sterling. Arthur knew that name. Everyone in Ravens Creek knew it. Charles Sterling owned half the county, the lumber mills, the processing plants, most of the commercial real estate. His family had been in the valley for 4 generations, building an empire on timber and political influence. He was currently running for state senate, his face on billboards from here to Seattle, promising to bring jobs back to rural Washington. A Sterling baby declared stillborn, but very much alive, hidden in a cabin rigged to burn with a convenient scapegoat already in place. This wasn't just murder, this was erasure. Arthur looked down at the infant who had finally quieted, its tiny chest rising and falling rapidly. The baby's eyes were open now, dark and unfocused, staring at nothing. So small, so completely helpless. Tommy Reeves had been 23 when Arthur's equipment had killed him. This baby was maybe a week old. Arthur had been cleared of responsibility for Tommy's death, but that hadn't stopped the guilt from eating him alive. If he walked away now, if he let this child die, there would be no investigation clearing him. There would be nothing but the knowledge that he'd saved himself and abandoned an infant to burn. He'd come here to die. But apparently, life had other plans. Arthur wrapped the baby more securely in the blanket and stood. His truck was still outside. He could be halfway to town before dawn, could go straight to the police with the baby and the evidence. Simple, clean. Let the authorities handle it. Except Sterling owned the sheriff. Sterling's family had controlled local law enforcement for decades through campaign donations and strategic appointments. Walking into the county sheriff's office with this baby would be like serving himself up on a platter. No, he needed to think this through, needed to figure out who he could trust. That's when he heard the vehicle. The engine sound was faint at first, growing louder as it navigated the rough track up to the cabin. Arthur killed his flashlight and moved to the broken window, peering out into the darkness. Headlights were visible through the trees, still a quarter-mile away, but approaching steadily. They'd come to light the fire, and Arthur was supposed to already be dead. He had minutes, maybe less. The baby started crying again, as if sensing his panic. Arthur grabbed his duffel bag with one hand, clutching the infant against his chest with the other, and moved toward the back door. The vehicle was closer now. He could see it was a black SUV, expensive, the kind Sterling security people drove. Arthur slipped out into the night, just as the SUV's headlights swept across the front of the cabin. The forest swallowed him immediately, dense and dark. Behind him he heard vehicle doors opening, boots on gravel, voices speaking in low, efficient tones. Supposed to be passed out by now. Doesn't matter, burn it anyway. Won't be conscious long enough to... Arthur didn't wait to hear the rest. He moved deeper into the woods, one arm wrapped around the baby, the other using trees to guide himself. He'd been a heavy machinery operator, not a woodsman, but panic gave him speed. Behind him, he heard the whoosh of an accelerant being poured, then the sudden roar as fire took hold. The cabin lit up like a signal flare, orange light dancing through the trees. Arthur pressed his back against a massive cedar and held his breath. The baby, miraculously, had gone quiet, perhaps lulled by the movement or simply exhausted. He could hear the men talking, their voices carrying through the night. Should have screamed, "Old drunk, probably didn't even wake up. Sterling wants confirmation, we need to..." Then a different voice, authoritative. "The truck's not here." Silence. Then rapid movement, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. "Find him, now!" Arthur ran. The forest at night was a nightmare of shadows and obstacles. Arthur stumbled constantly, his boots catching on roots, his face getting whipped by low branches. But he'd worked construction in terrain like this, had learned to read the ground even in darkness. He followed the slight downward slope, knowing it would lead to the river. The river meant noise to cover their movement, and potentially a way out of the valley. The baby was a problem. Every few minutes it would start crying, forcing Arthur to stop and cradle it, rocking gently until it quieted. Each stop felt like an eternity, every sound amplified in his ears. Behind him he could hear the searchers, at least 3 of them, moving in a coordinated pattern, their flashlights creating a moving fence of light. They were professionals. Arthur was a 55-year-old alcoholic with bad knees. He needed help. He needed someone he could trust. And there was only one person in Ravens Creek who fit that description. Dr. Sarah Jenkins had treated Arthur twice during his spiral, once for alcohol poisoning, once for a broken hand, when he'd punched a wall during a blackout. Both times, she'd been the only person in the ER who'd treated him like a human being, instead of just another drunk wasting resources. She was young, maybe 30, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. More importantly, she wasn't from Ravens Creek. She'd moved here 2 years ago from Seattle, which meant she wasn't tied to the Sterling family web. But getting to her clinic meant making it through 5 miles of forest, then another 3 miles through town, with a baby, while being hunted. Arthur adjusted his grip on the infant and kept moving. The river appeared suddenly, a roaring presence in the darkness. Arthur almost walked straight into it. The ground simply dropped away, revealing a steep bank and churning black water below. He pulled up short, breathing hard, sweat mixing with the light rain that had started to fall. A flashlight beam swept across the space he'd occupied seconds before. Tracks leading this way. Arthur looked down at the river. The water was high from recent rains, moving fast and dangerous. But on the other side, maybe 30 yards across, he could see lights. A logging road, civilization. He couldn't swim it. Not with the baby, but 20 yards upstream, a massive fallen tree bridged the river, its trunk thick enough to walk across if you had balance and no fear of heights. In daylight, Arthur would have never attempted it, but in darkness, with men hunting him, it looked like the only option. He climbed onto the tree trunk, the bark slick with rain and moss. The baby shifted in his arms, and Arthur wrapped his jacket around it more securely, creating a makeshift sling. One hand for the baby, one hand for balance. He took a step, then another. The flashlights found him. There! Arthur didn't look back. He moved faster, his boots slipping, his heart hammering. The river roared below, ready to swallow them both. Behind him, he heard shouting, then the crack of a gunshot. The bullet hit the tree trunk a foot from his head, spraying bark. They were shooting at him, shooting at a man carrying an infant. These weren't just Sterling security, these were killers. Arthur reached the middle of the fallen tree, his legs shaking. Another shot, closer this time. The baby started crying, its wails lost in the roar of the river. Arthur looked down at the dark water and made a decision. He jumped. The water was so cold it stopped his heart. Arthur had experienced cold before. Winters in Washington could be brutal. But river water in October was a different beast entirely, a liquid cold that bit through every layer and went straight to the bone. He hit the surface awkwardly, trying to keep the baby above water, and immediately lost his orientation. Which way was up? Where was the shore? The current grabbed them and pulled. Arthur's boots filled with water, dragging him down. His lungs screamed for air. The baby. Where was the baby? He could feel it in his arms, could feel it moving, but was it breathing? Was its face above water? Arthur's boot hit something solid, a rock. He pushed off, breaking the surface, gasping. The baby coughed and immediately started crying, the most beautiful sound Arthur had ever heard. The child was alive. But they were still in the river, still being swept downstream at terrifying speed. Arthur spotted an overhanging branch and lunged for it, his fingers closing around wet wood. For a moment he thought he'd lost his grip, but then his years of manual labor paid off. Muscles he'd built carrying steel and concrete didn't fail him now. He pulled them both out of the current and collapsed on the bank, water streaming from his clothes. The baby screamed in his arms, its cries sharp with outrage and fear. Arthur's hands were so numb he could barely feel the tiny body, but he could see the chest moving, see the mouth open. Alive, still alive. Behind them, across the river, flashlight beams searched the water, but the current had carried them a good 100 yards downstream, and the darkness was thick. Arthur waited until the lights moved away before attempting to stand. His legs nearly gave out. The cold had sapped his strength, and the adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him shaking and disoriented. But the logging road was visible now, maybe 50 yards upslope. He could make it. He had to make it. Arthur wrapped his jacket more tightly around the baby and started walking. The logging road led to a maintenance station, a small building housing equipment for the Forestry Service. Arthur broke a window and climbed inside, finding a space heater, and, miracle of miracles, it still worked. He stripped off his wet clothes and wrapped himself and the baby in emergency blankets he found in a supply closet. The baby had stopped crying, which terrified Arthur until he checked and found it was just sleeping, its breathing steady and strong. The hospital tag was still on its ankle, the code clearly visible, RVN Sterling, 2419, stillborn. Arthur stared at it, his mind working through the implications. A Sterling baby declared dead but kept alive, hidden in a cabin that was sold to a convenient scapegoat, an incendiary device set to destroy the evidence, and now men with guns hunting him through the forest. This wasn't just about hiding a scandal. This was about erasing a human being. But why? Arthur found his phone in his duffel bag, miraculously still dry in its waterproof case. No signal. They were too deep in the valley. But he took photos of the hospital tag, of the baby, of everything he could think of. Evidence. If something happened to him, maybe someone would find these photos and figure it out. The baby woke up hungry, its cries thin and desperate. Arthur had nothing, no formula, no bottles, nothing. He tried giving it water from his canteen, but the infant just coughed and cried harder. How long could a baby this young go without food? Hours, minutes. He needed to get to Dr. Jenkins, now. Arthur dressed in his still damp clothes, wrapped the baby in the driest emergency blanket, and stepped back out into the rain. The logging road would take him to State Route 14, then into Ravens Creek. 3 miles, maybe less. He started walking. He made it a quarter-mile before the black SUV appeared behind him. Arthur dove into the ditch as the vehicle accelerated, its engine roaring. He rolled through mud and brambles, clutching the baby, as the SUV skidded to a stop. Doors opened. Boots hit pavement. "Come on out, Mr. Miller. Let's talk about this." The voice was calm, almost reasonable. Arthur recognized it, the authoritative one from the cabin, the one giving orders. "That baby you've got? It doesn't exist. No birth certificate, no records, nothing. You can't prove where you got it, but we can prove you're a drunk with a history of erratic behavior who kidnapped a child. That's how this goes, if you make it difficult." Arthur said nothing. He was maybe 20 feet into the tree line, hidden by darkness and undergrowth. The baby was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as if it understood the danger. "The Sterling family takes care of their problems, Mr. Miller. You can be part of the solution or part of the problem. Your choice. But either way, that baby doesn't leave this valley alive." Arthur heard the click of a gun being cocked. "Last chance. Bring the baby out, walk away. We'll even give you money. Enough to start over somewhere else, or we come in there and get messy. Your call." Arthur looked down at the infant in his arms. Its eyes were open, dark and unfocused, staring at nothing, so small, so completely defenseless. Tommy Reeves had been 23. This baby was barely a week old, but the principle was the same, someone powerless, someone who depended on others to keep them safe. Arthur had failed Tommy. He wouldn't fail this child. He moved deeper into the forest, using every trick he'd learned in 3 decades of working in terrain like this. He knew how to move quietly, how to use the contours of the land to stay hidden. Behind him he heard cursing, then flashlights, then the sound of pursuit. But Arthur had something they didn't: desperation and nothing left to lose. Dr. Sarah Jenkins lived above her clinic in a small apartment that smelled like coffee and antiseptic. Arthur knew this because he'd woken up there once, after a particularly bad episode. She'd let him sleep it off on her couch rather than admitting him to the hospital, had made him breakfast and driven him home without judgment or lecture. He reached the clinic at 4:30 a.m., having circled through town's back alleys to avoid the main streets. The baby had started crying again. Weak, desperate cries that told Arthur they were running out of time. He went around to the back door and knocked. Nothing. Arthur knocked harder, then tried the handle. Locked. He looked around for something to break the window with, but before he could act, a light came on inside. A moment later the door opened, and Sarah stood there in pajamas and a robe. her hair pulled back in a messy bun. Her eyes went wide when she saw him. "Arthur, what the—" Then she saw the baby. "Oh my God! I need your help." Sarah pulled him inside and locked the door behind them. "Whose baby is that? Arthur, what's going on?" Arthur laid the infant on the examination table, his hands shaking. "Feed it first. I'll explain everything, but please, it hasn't eaten in hours." Sarah's professional training kicked in. She examined the baby quickly, checking vitals, looking for injuries. "He's dehydrated and malnourished, but alive. Hold on." She disappeared into the back and returned with a bottle of formula and a baby bottle. "I keep some on hand for emergencies. Let me warm this up." While the baby ate, sucking desperately at the bottle, tiny hands clutching Sarah's fingers, Arthur told her everything. The cabin, the hidden compartment, the incendiary device, the men hunting him. Sarah listened in silence, her face growing paler with each detail. When he finished, she looked down at the hospital tag still on the baby's ankle. "RVN Sterling, 2419, stillborn," she read aloud. Then her face changed. "Oh no, you recognize it?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I was on shift 3 nights ago when a young woman came in. Emergency C-section, complications. The baby was in distress. They rushed him to NICU. I was busy with other patients, didn't follow up, but I remember the family name on the chart, Sterling. And? The next day the chart was gone, scrubbed from the system. I asked the head nurse about it and she told me the baby had been stillborn and the family wanted privacy." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "But I saw that baby, Arthur. He was alive, screaming." "Who was the mother?" "Rebecca Sterling. Charles Sterling's youngest daughter, 19 years old, unmarried." Sarah's expression hardened. "This is about the campaign, isn't it? Charles Sterling is running for Senate. He's built his entire platform on family values, traditional morality. An unmarried teenage daughter having a baby would destroy that image. So he decided to kill the baby? Not kill, erase. As far as official records show, this child was never born." Sarah looked down at the infant, who had finished eating and was falling asleep in her arms. But someone had a conscience. Someone hid him instead of killing him outright. Someone hoped he'd be found. And when I bought the cabin, that became impossible. So they had to burn the evidence. Sarah paced the small examination room. "We need to go to the police. We have the baby, we have evidence. Sterling owns the sheriff. You said it yourself, the hospital records were scrubbed. How deep does this go? Who can we trust?" Sarah stopped pacing. "I don't know, but we can't just hide. They'll find us eventually." As if to prove her point, Arthur's phone buzzed. He'd turned it off earlier to save battery, but now it showed a text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Miller, you have something that belongs to the Sterling family. Return it undamaged and this ends quietly. Refuse, and we'll be forced to involve local authorities. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your history of mental instability and alcohol abuse. You have 6 hours to decide." The sweeper Arthur showed the message to Sarah. She read it twice, her jaw tightening. The sweeper, that's what they call him. Charles Sterling's fixer. Nobody knows his real name. He handles problems that need to disappear. Like babies? Like anyone Sterling wants gone. Sarah's hands were shaking now. "Arthur, these people don't make threats. If they say 6 hours, they mean it. Then we have 6 hours to figure out who we can trust." But before either of them could speak again, they heard it. The sound of vehicles pulling up outside the clinic. Multiple vehicles, doors opening, heavy boots on pavement. Arthur looked out the window and counted 4 SUVs, at least a dozen men. They were surrounding the building. Sarah's face went white. "How did they? They probably tracked my phone." Arthur pulled the SIM card out and crushed it under his boot. "Too late now," a voice called out from outside, amplified by a megaphone. "Dr. Jenkins, Mr. Miller, we know you're in there. Send out the baby and this ends peacefully. You have 5 minutes to comply." Sarah looked at Arthur, then at the sleeping infant on the examination table. "What do we do?" Arthur thought about Tommy Reeves. Thought about the moment the hydraulic boom had swung wide, the split second where everything went wrong, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He'd been cleared of responsibility, but that hadn't changed the fundamental truth. A young man had died while under Arthur's care. This baby was under his care now, and this time he could do something about it. We fight, Doctor. Sarah Jenkins's clinic was a converted house, 2 stories, built in the 1920s, with a basement that had once been a coal cellar. Sarah led Arthur downstairs, carrying the baby, while above them they could hear the front door being tested. "There's a tunnel," Sarah explained, moving quickly through the cluttered basement. The previous owner was paranoid about nuclear war, built an escape route that connects to the old sewer system. "Where does it come out?" "Behind the library, 3 blocks away." "But Arthur," she stopped, turning to face him. "If we run, we're just delaying the inevitable. Sterling owns this town. We can't hide forever." "We don't need forever. We just need long enough to find someone who cares more about truth than money." "Who?" "The sheriff is Sterling's hunting buddy. The mayor owes his election to Sterling campaign donations. The county prosecutor—" "What about the state police?" Sarah blinked. "What?" "Sterling controls local law enforcement, but state police answer to Olympia. If we can get out of Ravens Creek, get to a state police barracks, make enough noise that it can't be quietly covered up." Above them, the front door crashed inward. Heavy footsteps thundered through the clinic. "Basement!" someone shouted. Sarah grabbed Arthur's arm and pulled him toward a dark corner where a heavy metal grate covered an opening in the floor. Together, they lifted it, Arthur's construction muscles making the difference, and Sarah descended into the darkness, the baby still secure in her arms. Arthur followed, pulling the grate closed behind them just as flashlight beams swept the basement. The tunnel was narrow, cold, and pitch black. Arthur used his phone's flashlight sparingly, not wanting to drain the battery, but the brief glimpses showed decades of neglect. Crumbling concrete, standing water, things scurrying in the darkness that he preferred not to identify. Sarah moved ahead of him with surprising confidence, one hand on the baby, the other trailing along the wall to guide herself. "I've used this tunnel once before," she said quietly, "when a domestic violence victim needed to disappear fast. The husband was a deputy sheriff. This was the only way to get her out safely. Did it work? She's alive and testifying at his trial next month. So, yes." They walked in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The tunnel gradually sloped upward, the air becoming slightly less fetid. Finally, Sarah stopped. "Here." Arthur's flashlight revealed a ladder leading up to another grate. Above them he could hear traffic. They were close to the surface. Sarah handed him the baby. "I'll check if it's clear. Wait for my signal." She climbed the ladder, pushed the grate aside slightly, and peered out. After a long moment, she waved Arthur up. They emerged behind the Ravens Creek Public Library, in a small loading area hidden from the street. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of grey and pink. The baby was awake, but quiet, its dark eyes watching everything with an intensity that seemed impossible for something so young. "Now what?" Sarah asked. Arthur looked around, getting his bearings. The library was in the old part of town, near the courthouse and the sheriff's office. Not ideal, but they were out of Sterling's immediate reach. "We need a vehicle, something that won't be immediately reported stolen." "I know a place." Sarah led him 3 blocks north to a church with a small parking lot. She approached a beaten-up Honda Civic and tried the door. Locked. But when she checked under the rear bumper, she found a magnetic key holder. "Pastor Williams keeps a spare key here. I've used his car before for emergencies." "Stealing from a church?" "Borrowing. I'll explain later." Sarah got behind the wheel while Arthur secured the baby in the back seat, fashioning a makeshift car seat from blankets and his duffel bag. It wasn't safe, wasn't legal, but it was better than nothing. Sarah started the car and pulled out of the parking lot just as 2 black SUVs turned onto the street behind them. "They've found us." "Drive." Sarah accelerated, the old Civic protesting but responding. The SUVs gave chase, their powerful engines quickly closing the distance. Ravens Creek streets were empty at this hour, too early for most businesses, too late for the bar crowd. Arthur watched the speedometer climb, 40, 50, 60 miles per hour on streets designed for 30. "Sarah, I don't think we're going to—" She cut him off by suddenly turning left, cutting through a gas station parking lot and emerging on a side street. The SUVs, moving too fast, overshot the turn and had to brake hard. It bought them maybe 20 seconds. "Where are we going?" Arthur asked. "Sterling owns the roads out of town in every direction, logging roads, private property, gated checkpoints. But there's one route he can't control." Sarah pointed ahead. The river. Arthur saw it. The old Highway 14 bridge, a narrow span that crossed the river into the next county. It was obsolete, scheduled for demolition, but still technically open to traffic. "Sarah, that bridge hasn't been maintained in years." "I know." The Civic hit the approach at 70 miles per hour. Behind them, the SUVs were accelerating, their drivers clearly having no intention of letting them cross. Arthur looked back at the baby, secured as well as he could manage in the makeshift seat, and made peace with whatever was about to happen. The bridge was worse than he'd feared. Steel grating instead of pavement, gaps where sections had rusted through, the whole structure swaying in the morning wind. The Civic's tires screamed on the metal, and Arthur could see the river far below, churning and grey in the dawn light. The first SUV followed them onto the bridge. The second hesitated, and that hesitation saved them. Halfway across, there was a sound like a gunshot as a support cable snapped. The bridge lurched violently to one side. Sarah fought the wheel, keeping the Civic on course, but behind them the first SUV's driver panicked. He swerved, the heavy vehicle hitting the rusted railing, and for a moment it looked like it might hold. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, the railing gave way. The SUV went over the side, tumbling end over end, before hitting the river with a massive splash. The second SUV, still on the Ravens Creek side, screeched to a stop. Sarah didn't slow down. She kept the Civic at maximum speed until they were across the bridge, across the county line, beyond Sterling's immediate reach. They made it another 5 miles before the adrenaline wore off, and Sarah had to pull over. She was shaking so badly she could barely hold the wheel. Arthur reached over and gently took her hands. "You saved us." "I killed those men. They were trying to kill a baby. They made their choice." Sarah looked back at the infant, still sleeping peacefully despite the chaos. "What's his name? We can't keep calling him the baby." Arthur thought about it, about the silence he'd been seeking when he bought the cabin, and the way this child's cries had broken through that silence. About Tommy Reeves and second chances and the strange mathematics of guilt and redemption. "Samuel," he said finally. "We'll call him Samuel." They found a state police barracks in Clarkston, 60 miles from Ravens Creek. Arthur walked in carrying Samuel, with Sarah at his side, and laid everything out for the duty sergeant: the cabin, the incendiary device, the hospital tag, the men with guns. The sergeant listened with growing incredulity. When Arthur finished, the man sat back and rubbed his face. "You're telling me that Charles Sterling, the Charles Sterling running for state senate, tried to have you and a baby murdered?" "Yes." "And you have proof?" Arthur laid his phone on the desk. "Photos of everything, the hidden compartment, the device, the hospital tag. Dr. Jenkins can testify about the scrubbed medical records." The sergeant examined the photos, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "I'm going to be honest with you. Charles Sterling is a powerful man with powerful friends. Making accusations like this without ironclad evidence—" "We have the baby," Sarah interrupted. "You can DNA test him. Prove he's Rebecca Sterling's son. That alone shows someone falsified medical records." "And how do we prove it was Charles Sterling who ordered it?" "All we have is your word against his. Sterling will say you kidnapped the baby, manufactured this story to extort him." The sergeant's voice softened slightly. "Look, I believe something happened, but believing and proving are different things. We need more." Arthur felt desperation rising in his chest. Then what do we do? The sergeant thought for a moment. You need a recording, someone confessing. Without that, this case dies in court, if it even makes it that far. How are we supposed to get Sterling to confess? I don't know, but that's what you need. The sergeant stood. I can protect you for 24 hours. After that, I'll have to turn you over to county authorities, which means Ravens Creek. Use that time wisely. Arthur and Sarah sat in a small conference room, Samuel sleeping in a makeshift crib fashioned from a cardboard box. Arthur stared at the wall, his mind racing. They needed a confession. But how? What about the mother? Sarah said suddenly. Rebecca Sterling. She had this baby. Even if Charles erased the records, she knows the truth. Sterling will have her locked down, probably doesn't even let her leave the house. So we go to her. Arthur looked at Sarah like she'd lost her mind. Go back to Ravens Creek? To Sterling's house? That's suicide. Only if we get caught. Sarah pulled out her phone and started searching. I know Rebecca. She came to my clinic once for routine checkup before she was showing. She was terrified. Said her father couldn't know. I think she wanted to keep the baby. But her father wouldn't allow it. Sarah, if we can get her on recording talking about what happened, about what her father did, that's your confession. Not from Sterling himself, but from his daughter, the mother of the baby. That might be enough. Arthur looked down at Samuel. The baby was awake now, those dark eyes fixed on him with unsettling intensity. A week old, and already this child had survived more than most people experienced in a lifetime. How do we even get close to her? Sarah smiled grimly. The Sterling estate has a medical office. Rebecca's still recovering from the C-section. She'll need follow-up care, and her regular doctor, Dr. Morrison, happens to be on vacation this week. Let me guess, you're covering his patients? I am now. The Sterling estate was exactly what Arthur expected. 20 acres of manicured grounds, a main house that looked like a plantation manor, security gates and cameras everywhere. Sarah drove up in her own car. They'd retrieved it from her clinic, gambling that Sterling wouldn't expect them to be bold enough to return to Ravens Creek. The guards at the gate checked her ID and appointment confirmation. Sarah kept her voice professional. Bored, just another doctor making a house call. They waved her through. Arthur was in the trunk. It was cramped, uncomfortable, and terrifying. Arthur could hear Sarah's muffled voice talking to the guards, hear the mechanical whir of the gate opening. The car moved forward, gravel crunching under tires, then stopped. I'll need to park here, Sarah said to someone. The baby is sleeping in the back seat. I'll need to leave him for just a moment while I check on Ms. Sterling. What baby? My nephew. I'm babysitting. Won't take long. Just a quick post-surgical examination. There was a pause then. Fine, but make it quick. Mr. Sterling doesn't like visitors. The car door opened and closed. Sarah's footsteps moved away. Arthur waited in the darkness, his heart pounding, until he heard her voice again, distant now. I'm going inside. Arthur, if you can hear me, I'll tap on the trunk 3 times when it's clear. 30 seconds passed. 40. Then 3 distinct taps. Arthur popped the trunk and climbed out, his muscles screaming from being cramped in the small space. Samuel was in the back seat, still sleeping, undisturbed. The estate grounds were eerily quiet, too quiet, as if the very air was being controlled and regulated. Sarah appeared around the corner of the main house, waving urgently. Arthur grabbed Samuel and followed her to a side entrance, a service door probably used by staff. Rebecca's room is on the 2nd floor. I'm supposed to examine her, but her father's home. He's in his study on the ground floor, but we'll have to be quiet. Indeed, they moved through the house like ghosts. The interior was ostentatiously wealthy. Marble floors, oil paintings, furniture that probably cost more than Arthur had earned in a year of construction work. Every surface gleamed with polish and care. Sarah led him up a curved staircase to the 2nd floor, then down a hallway to a bedroom door. She knocked softly. Come in. The voice was young, uncertain. Rebecca Sterling sat in a chair by the window, dressed in expensive pajamas, her face pale and drawn. She couldn't have been more than 19, with her father's sharp features, but her mother's gentle eyes. Those eyes widened when she saw Sarah, then widened more when she saw Arthur carrying a baby. Who? She stopped, staring at Samuel. Her whole body went rigid. "Is that your son?" Sarah said gently. "He's alive, Rebecca." The young woman stood, swaying slightly, then collapsed back into the chair. "No, they told me he died. They said—" Tears started streaming down her face. "They said he was stillborn. They wouldn't let me hold him. They took him away, and I never—" "They lied to you," Arthur said. "Your father tried to kill him. We saved him." Rebecca sobbed, great wrenching cries that she tried to muffle with her hands. I knew something was wrong. But father said it was for the best, said the campaign needed—" She looked up at them with red, streaming eyes. "Can I hold him, please?" Arthur handed her Samuel. The moment mother and child connected, something shifted in the room. Rebecca cradled her son, touching his face, his hands, his tiny feet, as if confirming he was real. Samuel made a small sound, and she laughed through her tears. "He's beautiful." "Rebecca," Sarah said carefully, "we need your help. Your father is hunting us. He wants Samuel dead, wants us dead to cover it up. We need evidence. We need you to tell the truth about what happened. He'll kill me. He tried to kill your son." Rebecca looked down at Samuel, something hardening in her expression. "What do you need me to do?" Sarah pulled out her phone. "Just tell us what happened, from the beginning." Rebecca took a shaky breath and began to speak. She talked about getting pregnant by a boyfriend her father disapproved of, about trying to hide it, about her father finding out and exploding with rage. She described being kept prisoner in her own home for months, watched constantly, forbidden from leaving or contacting anyone outside. He said the campaign was more important than anything, said I was selfish for getting pregnant, that I was destroying everything he'd worked for. When I went into labor, they took me to the hospital in the middle of the night. Dr. Morrison performed the C-section, and when I heard the baby cry, I was so relieved. But then father came into the room and told everyone the baby was stillborn. Just declared it, like it was a fact, and everyone believed him, or pretended to. What happened next? They gave me something, sedated me. When I woke up, they said the baby had been taken care of, that there was no body because they'd had him cremated immediately due to medical necessity. I wanted to see him, wanted proof, but father said it was better this way, cleaner. Rebecca's voice broke. I didn't even get to name him. His name is Samuel, Arthur said softly, if that's all right with you. Rebecca smiled through her tears. Samuel, it's perfect. Sarah's phone had recorded everything. It was enough. It had to be enough. But then they heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, purposeful footsteps. The door opened, and Charles Sterling walked in. Charles Sterling was 68 years old, but he carried himself like a man 20 years younger. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and the kind of face that looked good on campaign billboards. He was wearing an expensive suit, and his expression when he saw Arthur, Sarah, and Samuel was one of mild annoyance rather than surprise. I was wondering when you'd show up, he said calmly. Predictable, really. Rebecca is the obvious weak link. Rebecca clutched Samuel tighter. Father, please, be quiet. Sterling's voice was ice. You've caused enough problems. He looked at Arthur. Mr. Miller, you've been quite difficult to kill. I admire that in a way. Most people, when faced with overwhelming force, simply give up. But you kept fighting. Why? Arthur met his eyes. Because I've already lost everything that mattered. I've got nothing left to lose. Ah, the desperate man, even more dangerous than the brave one. Sterling walked further into the room, and Arthur noticed he was wearing gloves. Leather gloves in summer. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me that baby. Give me Dr. Jenkins' phone with whatever recording you've made, and then you're going to leave quietly. In exchange, I'll let you live. And if we refuse? Sterling smiled. You're standing in my house, having broken in illegally, holding my daughter's infant. A daughter who will testify that you kidnapped her child and threatened her into making false statements. Your word against the Sterling families. How do you think that ends? Sarah held up her phone. We've already sent the recording to the state police. It's over. Is it? Sterling pulled out his own phone and showed them the screen. That was District Attorney Michaels. He's an old friend. I called him 30 minutes ago when my security informed me a Dr. Jenkins was here. He's agreed to handle this situation personally. No state police involvement necessary. Arthur felt his stomach drop. Sterling had thought of everything. But there's another option, Sterling continued. I'm a reasonable man. The baby lives. I'll even set up a trust fund, ensure he's raised well, somewhere far from here. Rebecca never sees him again, but he grows up healthy and cared for. You two walk away with enough money to start over anywhere you want. Everyone wins. Except Samuel, Arthur said, who grows up never knowing his mother, who grows up knowing he was abandoned because he was inconvenient. He'll be alive. That's more than I was planning to offer. Rebecca stood, still holding Samuel. No. Sterling turned to his daughter, his expression hardening. Excuse me? I said no. He's my son. I'm keeping him. Rebecca, sit down. No! Her voice was stronger now, fueled by weeks of suppressed rage and grief. You lied to me. You tried to kill my baby. You've controlled my entire life and I'm done. I'm keeping him and I'm leaving. You're not going anywhere. Actually, a new voice said from the doorway, she is. They all turned to see a woman in her 50s standing there, elegant in a tailored dress, her face carefully composed. Arthur recognized her from campaign photos. Margaret Sterling, Charles's wife and Rebecca's mother. Margaret, Charles said carefully, this doesn't concern you. My grandson concerns me very much. Margaret walked into the room, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. As does what you've done to our daughter, to our family. I was protecting the family. You were protecting yourself, your campaign, your pride. Margaret looked at Rebecca, at Samuel, and something cracked in her carefully maintained composure. I knew what you were planning with the baby, and I said nothing. I chose the campaign over my grandson, and I've spent every day since living with that guilt. Margaret, but I'm not doing it anymore. She turned to Arthur and Sarah. I have copies of the real medical records. Dr. Morrison kept them, against my husband's orders. He gave them to me before he left on vacation, said if anything happened to Rebecca or the baby, I should release them. They're with my lawyer, along with my testimony. Charles Sterling's face went pale. You wouldn't. I already have. The state police have everything. They're on their way now. As if on cue, they heard sirens in the distance. Sterling looked around the room, at his wife, his daughter, the baby he'd tried to erase, the two strangers who'd ruined his carefully laid plans. His composure finally cracked. You've destroyed everything. The campaign, the family name, everything I built, you destroyed it, Margaret said quietly. The moment you put ambition ahead of family, the moment you looked at your grandson and saw an inconvenience instead of a child. The sirens were louder now. Arthur could see police vehicles coming up the drive, could hear shouting, footsteps. Charles Sterling pulled out a phone and made one last call. Sweeper, it's over. Stand down. Then he sat in a chair, suddenly looking all of his 68 years, and waited for the police to arrive. 3 months later, Arthur sat on the porch of his new cabin, watching the sunrise over the valley. This cabin was different from the first one, properly built, insulated, with running water and electricity. Rebecca Sterling had insisted on buying it for him with money from her grandmother's estate, money that Charles Sterling couldn't touch. Samuel, 3 months old now, growing fast, was asleep in a crib inside. Rebecca was in the guest room, still recovering from the ordeal, still learning how to be a mother. Margaret Sterling visited every week, embracing her role as grandmother with an intensity that suggested she was trying to make up for lost time. Charles Sterling was in jail, awaiting trial on charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and a dozen other counts. His campaign had collapsed spectacularly. The Sterling Empire was being dismantled piece by piece. The man who'd seemed untouchable had been brought down by a week-old baby and a drunk construction worker with nothing to lose. Dr. Sarah Jenkins had taken a job in Seattle, but she called regularly. She'd testified at the preliminary hearings, had been instrumental in getting Samuel's birth properly registered and Rebecca's medical records restored. She'd also, Arthur suspected, been the one to quietly ensure that Tommy Reeves's family received an anonymous donation that covered the rest of their expenses. Arthur heard footsteps and turned to see Rebecca coming out of the cabin carrying Samuel. "Morning," she said softly, sitting beside him. "Morning. He sleep okay?" "Better than me." She looked at her son, then at Arthur. "I never thanked you properly for saving him, for risking everything. You've thanked me plenty." "No, I haven't. You didn't know us, didn't owe us anything, but you fought for Samuel when the whole world said he didn't exist." She paused. Why? Arthur thought about the question, about Tommy Reeves and guilt and the strange mathematics of redemption, about how he'd come to the wilderness to die and instead found a reason to live. "Because somebody had to," he said finally, "and I happened to be there." They sat in silence, watching the sun climb higher. In the valley below, Arthur could see smoke rising from chimneys, could hear the distant sound of traffic on the highway. Life continuing, ordinary and precious. Samuel woke up and started fussing. Rebecca rocked him gently, humming a lullaby. Arthur watched them and realized something fundamental had shifted inside him. The guilt over Tommy hadn't disappeared. It might never fully disappear, but it had been joined by something else. Not redemption exactly, but purpose. He'd spent his whole life building things, roads, bridges, buildings, concrete and steel that would outlast him, but those were just objects. Samuel was a life, a human being who would grow up, have children of his own, contribute to the world in ways Arthur could never predict or measure. That was a better legacy than any bridge. "Arthur," Rebecca said, "Mom wants to know if you'll come to dinner Sunday. She's making pot roast." "I don't know. Last time she tried to set me up with her book club friend." Rebecca laughed. "She means well. She thinks you're lonely." "I'm not lonely anymore." And it was true. The silence Arthur had sought at the beginning, the empty, suffocating silence of grief and guilt, had been replaced by something better, the sound of a baby's cry, the warmth of family, chosen rather than given, the knowledge that he'd done something that mattered. He'd come to the wilderness to die. Instead, he'd learned how to live again, and somewhere in the valley below, in the town he'd left behind, life continued. The Sterling family's empire crumbled, but the people endured. And in that small cabin on the edge of nowhere, 3 broken souls, a washed-up construction worker, a teenage mother, and a baby who'd been declared dead before he'd had a chance to live, had somehow become a family. It wasn't the life Arthur had planned, but then the best things rarely are. Epilogue, 5 years later. The courthouse in Olympia was packed. Arthur sat in the gallery, wearing the only suit he owned, watching as the prosecution rested its case. Charles Sterling, older now, diminished by 5 years of legal battles and imprisonment, sat at the defense table, his expensive lawyers arrayed around him like armor that had already failed. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Arthur didn't feel triumph. He felt tired. The trial had dragged on for years, appeals and delays and Sterling's lawyers fighting every step. But Margaret Sterling's testimony, combined with the medical records, the recordings, and Arthur's own documented evidence, had been overwhelming. Charles Sterling was sentenced to 25 years. He'd be 93 when he got out, if he lived that long. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Arthur avoided them, slipping out a side entrance where Sarah was waiting with her car. "How do you feel?" she asked as he got in. "Like it's finally over." Is it ever really over? Arthur thought about that. No, but maybe that's okay. They drove back to Ravens Creek in comfortable silence. The town had changed in 5 years. New businesses, new people, the Sterling name no longer the dominant force it once was. But some things remained the same. The river still roared. The forest still loomed. And on the edge of town, in a small but well-maintained house, Rebecca and Samuel were waiting. Samuel was 5 now, starting kindergarten next week. He had his mother's gentle eyes and his grandfather's sharp mind, but he'd been raised with love and honesty. He knew his story, age-appropriate versions at least. He knew he was wanted, fought for, protected. When Arthur arrived, Samuel ran to him, hugging his legs. "Uncle Arthur, did you bring me something?" "Samuel manners," Rebecca chided, but she was smiling. Arthur pulled out a small wooden truck he'd carved himself. "Built this for you. It's got real wheels and everything." Samuel's eyes lit up. He took the truck and immediately started playing with it, making engine noises as he pushed it across the floor. Rebecca pulled Arthur aside. "The verdict? Guilty. 25 years. She nodded slowly. "Good. That's good." But she didn't look relieved. She looked sad. "He's still my father. Part of me wishes." "I know, but Samuel deserves better. Deserves to grow up without that shadow." "He will. He already is." They watched Samuel play, his innocent joy a stark contrast to the darkness of the trial, the evil his grandfather had attempted. Margaret Sterling arrived an hour later, bringing dinner and presents for Samuel. She'd divorced Charles shortly after his arrest, had spent 5 years rebuilding her relationship with Rebecca and her grandson. It wasn't easy. Trust, once broken, didn't heal overnight. But she was trying. That evening, after Samuel was asleep and the dinner dishes were cleared, Arthur sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, not whiskey. He'd been sober for 5 years, one day at a time. Sarah joined him. "You know what I realized today? You never told me why you bought that cabin in the first place, the real reason." Arthur was quiet for a long moment. "I was going to kill myself. Not immediately, not with a gun or anything dramatic, but I was planning to drink myself to death. Figured I'd earned it after everything." "And Samuel saved you?" "Samuel gave me a reason not to." Arthur looked at his hands, scarred, weathered, but steady. "I spent so long thinking about what I'd destroyed. But Samuel made me think about what I could build instead." "You built a family?" "We all did." The night was clear, stars visible despite the light pollution from town. Arthur thought about the chain of events that had led here. A cheap cabin, a hidden baby, a desperate flight through the forest. Any one of 1,000 things could have gone differently. He could have missed the crying, could have been passed out drunk, could have been too scared to fight. But he hadn't been. And because of that, a child lived, a family formed, a wrong was righted. It wasn't redemption for Tommy Reeves. Nothing could give that young man his life back. But it was something, a balance maybe, in the cosmic ledger of guilt and grace. "Uncle Arthur?" Samuel's voice came from behind him. The boy was in his pajamas, holding the wooden truck. "I can't sleep. Want me to read you a story?" Samuel nodded, and Arthur picked him up, carrying him inside. As he read from a picture book about brave knights and rescued princesses, Samuel's eyes drooped, the truck still clutched in his small hands. "Uncle Arthur," the boy mumbled, half asleep. "Yeah, buddy? When I grow up, I want to be like you. Someone who helps people." Arthur felt his throat tighten. "You're already better than me, Samuel. You just keep being you." Samuel smiled and drifted off to sleep. Arthur sat there for a long time, watching the child breathe, marveling at the strange path his life had taken. He'd gone to the wilderness to find silence. Instead, he'd found purpose. He'd gone to the forest to die. Instead, he'd learned how to live. And in the end, that made all the difference. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage meet in ways you never imagined. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.